En allavega Róbert veit, hann hérna og hann næstur maður á svið og ég ætla bara að bjóða hann velkominn, gjörið þið svo vel.
Iceland's economy is contracting at the fastest rate of any OECD economy. And this civil action movement, is the best news that I have heard about Iceland for several months. The movement signals that the population of Iceland is not just passively waiting for ministers and the central bank and the IMF to solve the problem. The population is trying to get involved in a constructive way. I think that is excellent news. In the Financial Times of the 2nd of July 2008, I wrote an article about Iceland called "Iceland Pays the Price for Financial Excess." Financial excess. It happened that on the morning of 2nd of July, I was at a conference together with John Lipsky, the number 2 man at the IMF. And when John Lipsky read my article in the Financial Times, he came running up to me and other participants at the conference and waved the Financial Times and said to me, "Thank you so much for writing this article. It is very valuable." So he at least was very enthusiastic about the appearance of this article. In Iceland, on the other hand, a great many economists and others were extremely disapproving of the article. I had some truly astonishingly negative emails from Icelandic economists about it. However, my favorite reaction was from your Prime Minister, who, when asked about it in an interview, dismissed the article as worth no more attention than a letter in DV. I had by that time come to Iceland several times, and 10 years ago I had spent a lot of time studying the East Asian crisis. By the summer of 2007, I was really worried about Iceland. I thought Iceland was dynamite waiting to explode because of the similarities with what happened in East Asia in the mid-1990s. So it is against that background that I'm not entirely surprised at what has happened here. But let me begin by talking about the global crisis, and then I'll come back to Iceland. Many analysts now agree that the world economy has entered not just a recession, but a depression. Paul Krugman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2008, said just 1 week ago from today, quote, "This looks an awful lot like the beginning of a second Great Depression." He went on to say that, quote, "Recent economic numbers have been terrifying, not just in the United States, but around the world. Manufacturing in particular is plunging everywhere. Banks are not lending, businesses and consumers are not spending." A depression is different from a recession, not just because it lasts for longer, and not just because the fall in output is greater, but also because there's a general fall in the price level, and a depression in particular because of this combination of falls in output and falling prices is very, very difficult to get out of. It looks like the world economy is entering such a depression. The crisis is clearly a crisis of the system, not just a crisis in the system. The East Asian crisis was a crisis in the world economy. This is a crisis of the world economy, and the first one since the 1930s. It is global in scope, so there are no fast-growing regions which can provide support for the resumption of growth in the crisis-affected regions. And also, secondly, it is the case that that policy instruments such as fiscal policy, monetary policy, and also the built-in stabilizers such as bankruptcy protection no longer work. They are no longer effective. The US government, for example, has been following the Colin Powell military doctrine of shock and awe with reference to the economy, that is, throwing every possible instrument at the problem, including the kitchen sink. But none of these things are working, and the news from the United States keeps getting worse. Looking forward, I suggest that the world economy will probably hit another tipping point similar to the one in September 2008 at the time of the Lehman Brothers collapse. It will probably hit a second tipping point around about March, April, May of this year, 2009. The tipping point will be caused by the rise of general awareness throughout Europe, America, Asia, Latin America, that hundreds of millions of people in rich countries and in poor countries are experiencing sharp falls in consumption standards, that the crisis is getting worse, not better, and that it has escaped the control of public authorities. So now, in these months, from January, February, March, April, May, is do or die time. This is the time when governments must take action to equip themselves to cope with a number of problems that are quite predictable. And I'm going to make now 4 predictions about what is happening. First of all, governments have to equip themselves to cope with a surge of unemployment. Secondly, a collapse of pension funds, of capital-funded pension funds because of the collapse of stock markets. Thirdly, governments have to cope with fierce anger being directed at them by their citizens, which may take the form of large-scale civil unrest. And fourth, I doubt whether there will be any significant recovery of economic growth in the world economy at large or in Iceland until late 2010 at the very earliest. Those are 4 predictions about what's coming. Governments know what's coming. They must act now to prepare themselves for these. On the other hand, there is good news about the world economy. And the first piece of good news, in my view, is that this current global crisis has discredited or delegitimized It has discredited the neoliberal or free market ideology that's dominated economic thinking for the past 30 years, here and elsewhere. Governments are having to intervene in the economy much more than in the past, not just in finance, because of this. The current crisis represents a spectacular market failure, and everyone, even neoclassical economists, have long accepted that market failure provides justification for government intervention. And so I think that this crisis may, amongst other things, provide grounds for advancing goals of a social democratic character. And another piece of good news, I have to admit, this next piece of good news is more speculative. But I suggest that as the world economy recovers from about 2015 onwards, the world and Iceland also are likely to experience some 2 to 3 decades of fairly stable growth, during which time, and this is the really important point, during which time productive capital, production capital, capital which is oriented towards making goods and services, rather than financial capital, will be dominant through this period, as production capital was dominant in the Western world from the end of the Second World War through to the early 1980s. I think we will return to such a period, and production capital will be much more supportive of the welfare state, of public infrastructure investment and so on, than finance capital has been over the past 3 decades. Now let me come to Iceland. I will post on the website a longer text than I'm going to talk to. I'm going to skip sections from the prepared text, but the first section I will go over now, and it is called, "Was the crisis in Iceland inevitable, even without a global crisis?" And the answer is yes. I want to begin by reporting to you what Peter Blundell, one of your favorite politicians, what Peter Blundell said just last night. He was talking to a parliamentarian from a friendly country, I better not say which one, but a friendly country which Iceland is very, very dependent on now for help. And in the course of this conversation, Peter Blundell told the parliamentarian that the crisis in Iceland was due entirely to the crisis in the United States. And he produced a list of 12 causes that the Independence Party had prepared to explain the crisis in Iceland, 12, of which exactly 4 had anything to do with Iceland, and 8 had to do with the United States. So he presented Iceland as an innocent victim of a crisis that came from elsewhere. The visiting parliamentarian looked at him in disbelief. And he thought to himself privately, he didn't say this, but he thought to himself privately that if this is the level of thinking of somebody who's been in the Helsinki for 30 years and is chair of the Economic and Economic and Tax Committee of the Helsinki, then he thought Iceland had some very serious structural problems. My argument is Iceland would have had a major financial crisis even without a global crisis, and for 2 main reasons. First of all, the very idea of making Iceland an international banking center was crazy from the start. And it was particularly crazy given the size of Iceland, given that it had its own currency, and given that it had free capital movements in and out. This was a recipe for disaster. The Baltics have certainly been badly hit by this crisis too. They are heavily in debt. The big difference between them and Iceland is that they were not trying to make themselves an international financial center, and the banks operating in the Baltics were not primarily domiciled in the Baltics. They were foreign banks. And therefore they had foreign lender of last resort support. The second reason is really important why Iceland would have experienced a major crisis. And that is because the economy over the 2000s had come to be based on a phony or simply unviable growth model. The growth model consisted of the government setting high interest rates, allowing free inflows and outflows of capital, So high interest rates attracted in lots of foreign capital to get advantage of the high interest rates. This pushed up the krona. This kept imports relatively cheap. And of course, it also made it very cheap for Icelanders themselves to borrow abroad. And so when I came here in the mid-2000s, I began to be just amazed at how Icelanders were borrowing as though there was no tomorrow. I was reminded of what would happen if my tailor who makes my suits, actually, as my partner will tell you, I have no suits, but suppose I had suits and a tailor who made them. If my tailor was prepared to go on making me suits indefinitely and giving me the credit to buy them with, then I would go on buying the suits. And I would build up an enormous collection of suits. And I would be the admiration of all my friends for my many splendid suits. The only problem would come when the tailor asked me to repay the suits. And then I would be in difficulty and I might have to sell the suits at fire sale prices. And that's what the situation that Iceland is now facing. In a sense, then, Iceland's problem is not the current crisis. The problem is how to scale down from what was a phony or fake or unviable consumption level of the past decade to a sustainable consumption level for the next decade. Icelanders have been enjoying a nearly free lunch, and at the end of the day, even as economists know, there is no free lunch. Let me skip the next two sections. One of them, the next one's called, Could the government have taken preemptive action to soften the crisis, to give a soft landing? And the answer is very clearly yes, if they were listening. And the next section, which I'll also skip, is the very sensitive one of who is accountable. Who is accountable? What I want to talk about is what I think the government should do now. As I said before, for the next few months, there is some breathing room. But around about May, Iceland is going to have to refinance some pretty big debt. And the terms on which this debt is refinanced depends quite a lot on what is done now. So, some immediate steps. The first immediate step is for a team of forensic accountants, not ordinary accountants, forensic accountants, and sovereign debt restructuring experts. I am astonished that the government has left it so late to do this, because without this basic information, policy is without direction, and in fact the government seems to have been steering all over the road, lacking this basic information. The second immediate step is to invite the governor of the central bank to seek employment. I think that everyone who has looked at Iceland from the outside, including Willem Buiter, who will be speaking here next week, and including Richard Portes, who was rather critical of my article in the Financial Times, but everybody is astonished that the governor of the central bank is still in place. If he could be found an ambassadorship to Vanuatu, which is a low atoll in the middle of the Pacific, vulnerable to... this would be a sure sign to the outside world, outside financial markets that Iceland was serious in dealing with its difficulties. And the third immediate step is simply for the Prime Minister to apologize to the nation. Let me say something. I'm running out of time. I want to say something about almost immediate steps. As I said, not just in Iceland, but in the world at large, a great surge of unemployment, or something like unemployment, is coming. I think that it's really important for the Icelandic government to set up teams of people to study what is being done in other comparable countries in order to protect employment and minimize unemployment. Possible measures include such things as subsidize employers to offer apprenticeships to school leavers, or to subsidize employers to place employees on short-time working instead of firing them by paying the employees their missing days. Or thirdly, provide public works programs doing real work for the minimum wage, from social work through to construction. A number of things can be done. It is really urgent that, in particular, the young people do not find themselves having to depend on unemployment benefit. Secondly, urgent steps have to be taken to protect pensions. There's going to be huge anger, I mean, even greater anger directed at the government if pensions start to collapse and retirees find that their expected income is way, way below what they were expecting it to be. I mean, their actual income is way below what they're expecting it to be. Obviously, all this pain has to be shared, but there is a danger that people on pensions will take much more than proportional pain. Thirdly, financial regulation restructuring. Clearly, there's going to be a move around the world towards treating finance more like alcohol, or drugs, or explosives, or weapons of mass destruction, or gambling. All of these are activities where the unrestricted distribution of explosives and weapons of mass destruction and gambling and the like create large external costs for the society, so that the market for the product is necessarily restricted. Finance will, or some kinds of finance, will come to be seen in the same light. I think also governments generally will try and create banking systems which give more weight to stability and prudence and less weight to innovation, to financial innovation. We may see the emergence of what you could call mixed banking systems, with some component of public banks that operate more like utilities, like electricity utilities, together with private banks, private profit-seeking banks. And in Iceland specifically, obviously the mandate and the competence of the central bank and the Financial Services Authority need to be subject to considerable improvement, let us say. Civil service reform. I, as an outsider, have been amazed that Iceland has nothing like a civil service commission or commissioner. That is somebody or some group of people who scrutinize the recruitment of people to the civil service and the promotion of people to high position within it, to permanent secretaryships, for example. I am amazed that these recruitment and promotion decisions are made without reference to a third party, an external body, which scrutinizes the decisions in terms of criteria of merit, of qualifications. And one place Iceland might look to get ideas about how to design a really effective civil service is Singapore. Just to give an example, the top-level salaries of civil servants in Singapore are set by a formula which averages the top 10 or so salaries of private people working in the private sector in the same broad domain, so that the top legal people in the government of Singapore have salaries that are set in relation to the top salaries of lawyers in the private sector in Singapore. This is a way of ensuring that it is a really attractive prospect to go into the civil service. But on the other hand, Singapore comes down like a ton of bricks on anybody who is found to be corrupt, who is found to be nepotistic, appointing their relatives to positions, appointing their friends to positions. The moment any evidence of these behaviors comes out, these civil servants are fired. I want to finish now on the question of Eurozone entry. My first point is that Iceland clearly has to give up the idea of making itself a centre for international banks. There are simply too many alternative places which, going forward, do not have the toxic reputation that Iceland now has as a centre of international banking. So the country has to urgently develop other sources of economic activity. Nevertheless, obviously, a normal banking system has to be established, and for this purpose, there are some big advantages of joining the Eurozone. It is true that there's a lot of discussion going on in some of the capitals of the Eurozone about getting out of the euro, in Rome, in Madrid, in Dublin. There's a lot of dissatisfaction with remaining in the euro because of the loss of sovereign control over the exchange rate and over interest rates. Nevertheless, and so therefore people in Iceland who are opposed to Eurozone entry say, but look, there's all this discussion going on, the Eurozone is going to break up, so that's the last thing we want to join. I think this discussion about leaving the Eurozone that's going on in some places will not come to very much, because the costs of going out and making your currency then vulnerable to speculation would simply be too high. So in the end, these countries will stay in. And if Iceland stays out of the euro, or there's another possibility which I'll come to in a minute, if it stays out of the euro, its currency will continue to be subject to speculative attack, which will just mess up the whole economy. So I think there are certainly advantages about going for Eurozone entry. But, and one other of the advantages, in addition to macroeconomic stability, one other advantage is simply that it would subject Iceland's bureaucracy to common European standards, and that would might help to offset the bureaucracy's present tendencies towards nepotism and corruption and those other things. However, and this is my last point, there is an alternative to joining the Eurozone, or at least there's a prelude to it, and that is to form an agreement with Norway that, first of all, the Icelandic krona would be managed so as to shadow the Norwegian krona, and secondly, that the Norwegian Central Bank would stand ready to provide currency swap support to the Icelandic Central Bank. This would certainly have some substantial advantages for Iceland, as well as some disadvantages. But the big question is, what would be the interest of Norway in such an agreement? Well, Norway might see a number of advantages in having such an agreement with Iceland. For one thing, Norway would be less isolated in the European Economic Area if Iceland were to stay out of the Eurozone. And for another thing, Norway might be better placed to defend its fisheries policy against the destructive EU fishery policy if Iceland did not go into the euro and did not have to adopt the EU fisheries policy. So, for those reasons, Norway might have an interest in helping Iceland to stay out of the Eurozone and therefore in making a cooperative agreement in terms of the currency. On the other hand, it is possible that Norway's interest might actually be to see Iceland going in first to the Eurozone in order to see what the EU or the European Commission did about Iceland's fisheries policy, in the hope that the European Commission might moderate its destructive fisheries policy in its application to Iceland, one, because Iceland has the reputation of having actually managed fisheries well, as in the last issue of The Economist, and secondly, because they see that fisheries is going to be more important in Iceland in post-crisis than it has been in the past decade. So for those two reasons, the EC might somewhat moderate its fisheries policy, and that might be then good news for those people in Norway who wish to see Norway in the Eurozone, but who are blocked by the fisheries issue. Okay, so clearly these are really important issues to be clarified with the Norwegian government. Clearly the Icelandic government has a very complex decision ahead of it on the EU and EU membership. And clearly, too, there is a good case for the Icelandic government to call elections in order to seek a fresh mandate from the citizens.
Róbert Veit, góða gestir. Við þakkum honum kærlega fyrir hans framlag til fundarins.